And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for a global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Woo-geun. It is indeed time for Global Insight. South Korea's President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol spoke with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping on Friday, marking the first interaction between Seoul's incoming administration and Beijing. Their conversation lasted 25 minutes, touching upon bilateral ties ahead of Yoon's inauguration on May 10th, as well as cooperation on dealing with a nuclear North Korea. While the agendas seem to stick to formalities, many are questioning how South Korea and China's relations will change once Yoon takes office, as he has shown strong support for Washington amid its strategic rivalry with Beijing. We discuss what may be on the cards, and for this I'm joined by Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Head of International Studies and Professor of International Relations at King's College London. We're also joined by Robert Ross, Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Associate of the John King Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. A very warm welcome to you both. And well, beginning with you, Professor Pacheco Pardo, it's lovely to see you again. South Korea's President-elect Yoon spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone on Friday. I wonder what you made of the conversation and how you think that Beijing is really perceiving the conservative President-elect's win.
Well, I think it was interesting because this was the first time that a Chinese president spoke with a president-elect, so before the president actually took office. So I think this underscores the importance that both countries give to the bilateral relationship, but also the importance that China, and Xi Jinping in this case, gives to having good relations with the incoming president. I would assume that China isn't particularly happy with the election of the new president. When he was candidate, Yoon Suk-yeol, he made clear that he wanted to take a tougher approach on China. But having said that, during the last 2 years of the Moon administration, relations between South Korea and China have really nosedived. There has been criticism from South Korea, from President Moon himself, about the way China dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. South Korea has been participating in maritime exercises together with the U.S., the Quad countries, with other countries as well, such as Canada, for example, or European countries. And more generally, we have seen a deterioration in relations, both diplomatic relations and security relations between South Korea and China over the past 2 years. And I think this is likely to continue under President-elect Yoon once he takes office in May.
And Professor Ross, well, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, he did indeed pledge to strengthen the South Korea-US alliance and diversify South Korea's trade, reducing its dependence on the Chinese market. And well, how do you think that Yoon Suk-yeol's electoral victory has been received in Beijing?
I think the Chinese see the last 5 years as successful for China. They've had a president in South Korea who basically had the same policy toward North Korea as China did, and who worked hard to cooperate with China and North Korea. And the 3 no's that President Moon offered China back in the beginning of his term were reassurances to China that South Korea would not cooperate with the United States against China. So the status quo was the last 5 years, and they're going to watch very carefully what President Yoon does, particularly with respect to missile defense, cooperation with the U.S.-Japan alliance. Should he move South Korea in a different direction and collaborate with American Indo-Pacific policy, its containment with China, its security relationship directed at China, I think South Korea can expect some significant retaliation. Of course, it was quite painful last time, both the economic sanctions China imposed on South Korea, the heightened military presence in the Yellow Sea, and second time around, China may say, well, perhaps South Korea hasn't learned the lesson. We care about these things deeply. And so perhaps should President Yoon return to President Park's policies on missile defense in particular, and the U.S.-Japan alliance, we might see even stiffer economic sanctions.
And of course, South Korea has been in a state of dilemma for quite a while, having to always being pressured to choose between its greatest security partner and its largest trading partner. And while Professor Pacheco Pardo, Yoon appeared to have sided with Washington amid this U.S.-China competition. But is it realistic, though, to expect Seoul to make a deliberate turn away from Beijing, given its economic ties and, of course, the issue of North Korea? Or do you think Yoon is going to have to maintain a certain level of strategic ambiguity in handling the South's relations with Washington and Beijing?
Well, I think President-elect Yoon has made clear that he's going to try to cooperate with China and North Korea, and this came out from the call that he had with Xi Jinping as well a couple of days ago. I mean, the peak in relations between South Korea and China was really 2013-15 under President Park, when Xi signed the FTA with China, when Xi visited Beijing for the celebration of the end of the Second World War, the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And since then, relations haven't really recovered to the good times, really, from that period, 2013-15. So I would assume that under President-elect Yoon, we will see Korea continue to move closer to the U.S., closer to other countries, for example, Europe. There has been a strengthening relations between Korea and Europe in recent years, and one of the key reasons really has been to contain China. So I would assume this to continue. I think that President-elect Yoon, he may try to indicate that he's not willing to side against China, but I don't think his actions will actually follow from his words. In the same way that President Moon over the past couple of years hasn't even talked really about the strategic ambiguity, because I don't think China thinks this exists anymore in South Korean foreign policy. And I think this is going to become clearer under President-elect Yoon once he takes office, and he's going to be more vocal, really, in criticizing China.
Professor Ross, well, for years, South Korea has been trying to gain the support of China in dealing with North Korea's security issues. But it seems now that Beijing and Pyongyang are closer than ever before. Do you think China is going to be at all instrumental in dealing with these security issues? And do you think it's even interested in North Korea's denuclearization at this point?
This is an interesting question. So in the past 5 years, China, particularly the last 2 or 3 years, China has expanded trade relations with North Korea, interrupted by the pandemic, including investment relations have improved. And ironically, that is what South Korea itself wanted to do with North Korea, only to find obstacles indeed from the United States under the Trump administration and some reluctance under the Biden administration. So it's not quite accurate to say that China wasn't helpful, because it was actually South Korea's policy as well. Now, of course, the one exception is the last few months, last year or so, with North Korea doing more missile testing. One might expect the Chinese to put some pressure on North Korea to cease these operations. But I think they're done helping, if you will, the United States in its North Korea policy. The United States puts economic sanctions on China, technology sanctions, a global coalition against China, improving relations with Taiwan, while the South Korean government is increasingly recognizing the rise of China, cooperating with China. China is much less reluctant to say, we need to be on the side of the United States in putting pressure on North Korea if we want to have good relations with South Korea. I think China is more confident now that South Korea is facing much more constraints, and regardless of China's North Korea policy, South Korea has to find a way to get along with China, particularly when they both see engagement with North Korea as the only reasonable, realistic path forward.
Professor Pacheco, Pardo, South Korea and the U.S. are expected to strengthen their bilateral alliance under the Yoon administration. And the president-elect, he's mentioned placing additional anti-missile defense systems in the country. Do you think North Korea's recent ICBM test is going to strengthen the case for this? I mean, what kind of ways do you think Seoul and Washington are going to strengthen their security alliance? That's to you, Professor Pacheco, Pardo.
To conduct tests, the stronger the case for that deployment to continue. There's also talk about, of course, about greater intelligence sharing on China, not only at the bilateral level, but also trilateral intelligence sharing, including with Japan. And there's also talk about a nine-country alliance, of which Korea would be part, together with some other Indo-Pacific countries, also European countries, to share intelligence on China. So what we see here is that this is becoming more multifaceted. I also would expect Korea to be more open about its participation in joint maritime training exercises, which are really targeting China. And South Korea might be also willing actually to participate in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea and be vocal about its participation. So in a sense, not only deploying its military assets, but openly discussing and saying that it is cooperating with the U.S., with Indo-Pacific countries, also with European countries, in trying to contain Chinese behavior. So I think we're going to see a broadening of the scope of cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea to try to contain China, along with other partners, but also South Korea being more open about the type of activities that it is doing.
So we're seeing more like-minded countries continuing to work closer together based on shared values and liberal values, of course. But at the same time, Professor Ross, there are growing concerns that the likes of China, Russia, and North Korea are going to work together to weaken America and its alliance, and that Pyongyang testing its ICBMs might not necessarily be a bad thing for Moscow and Beijing. What do you make of this view?
Well, first, I want to say once again that should South Korea find itself participating, let's say, in freedom of navigation operations or a vocal voice against China in containment with the United States, they would be the outlier for the most part in East Asia. Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, none of these countries participate in freedom of navigation operations. None of them have a vocal voice in supporting containment. So if South Korea went out on that limb to be consciously supporting American containment of China, I think South Korea would be in for a rough ride. Now, yes, the United States is finding itself in a difficult situation in dealing with China, North Korea. The Ukraine situation has preoccupied the United States, and other countries are taking advantage of it, including Iran, including China, including North Korea. And they're all benefiting, if you will, from the war in Ukraine. The United States has been trying to pivot to East Asia since 2010. Every time it tries, it gets drawn back into Europe or into the Middle East or the Persian Gulf. And this is happening once again. So even for this reason alone, these countries are less inclined to cooperate with the United States because they're finding the United States less able to compete with China, with North Korea in East Asia. Now, for North Korea's part, what a perfect time to increase testing when America is preoccupied elsewhere. Regarding Sino-Russian cooperation with North Korea, now Russia's not really a player here, never has been a player. The 2+2 talks no one ever suggested Russia should be part of them. But to expect greater Chinese cooperation with North Korea, I think it's going to move ahead quite quickly as the pandemic winds down, trade is going to increase, investment will increase, because China and South Korea, under the Moon presidency, agreed that engagement was the best way to deal with a nuclear power, because over the long term, both countries agreed North Korea was not going to denuclearize, so you had to get in there with your trade, with your investment, with your tourism, and gradually moderate this system. And that's been Chinese policy. It's been engagement, just the United States engaged China, just as the Obama administration wanted to engage Cuba. And this was the Moon policy, and I expect this to go forward. Is this cooperation against the United States? I don't think so. I think this is just recognizing the reality of North Korea as a nuclear power, which China sees its government as somewhat unpredictable and wants to use trade and investment to try and moderate its behavior.
Professor Pacheco, Pardo, I wonder what you think about this, about Moscow, Beijing and Pyongyang working a bit closer together, and also what you think North Korea's next steps are going to be.
Well, from a European perspective, it's been quite interesting to see Korea has been one of the very few countries really across the world that has supported the sanctions on Russia, right? We have, of course, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore in Asia, but no other Asian country is actually trying to support Europe, the U.S., as they try to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. So I think this has actually, in my view, this has indicated that within Korea, not only the current administration, because this was as part of the campaign, there has been this shift towards making values actually more important as part of the foreign policy, because Korea is actually taking an economic hit from supporting the sanctions. Korean chaebol are actually suffering. the bottom line because they are supporting the sanctions as well. So I would expect that with President-elect Yoon taking office in a few weeks' time, that we will see more of this, that we will see more of Korea siding more openly with the United States, with European countries, with like-minded countries, as you put it before, and willing to take the economic hit as it is doing right now. Of course, China has far stronger relations with South Korea than that Russia does, right? But having said that, we have also seen South Korea trying to diversify its economic relations towards other countries, for example, in Southeast Asia. So I think if South Korea is able to somehow manage this, it would be in a better position to withstand the economic sanctions that no doubt would come from China if South Korea becomes more open about its support for the U.S. containment policy.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to leave the interview. That was Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, and Robert Ross, Professor of Political Science at Boston College. Thank you both so much for your time today.